I know exactly what's happening here. Brett! People like you come in, and suddenly everything changes.
If you've ever wondered what happens when prejudice collides with truth on the most important day of someone's life, then settle in. Because on Magnolia Street in Richmond, Virginia, a quiet, tree-lined road where neighbors wave politely and everything looks perfect on the surface, one woman's hatred turned a beautiful celebration into a moment that would change an entire community forever. The afternoon sun cast golden light through the branches as Marcus Bennett straightened his tie one last time. Behind him, the backyard hummed with quiet preparation. White chairs arranged in perfect rows beneath ancient magnolia trees. A string quartet rehearsing softly in the corner, their melodies drifting out toward the street like whispered promises. Marcus's mother dabbed her eyes near the garden gate. His father stood with the other groomsmen, hands clasped, pride radiating from every weathered line on his face. Lisa's church family filled the yard with gentle laughter and warm embraces. Mentors who'd watched these two struggle through medical school, through long hospital shifts, through years of sacrifice. They were all here, waiting to see Marcus and Lisa finally say the words they'd been rehearsing in their hearts for years. You could feel it in the air. The joy, the anticipation, the sense that something sacred was about to unfold. And if you paid close attention, you could also sense the nerves. Because after everything they'd been through, Lisa's exhausting hours at the pediatric clinic, Marcus's late nights at city meetings, the quiet storms that come when two people try to build something worthy of each other, they wanted this day to be perfect. 7-year-old Maya, Lisa's niece, practiced her flower girl walk near the garden gate. She clutched her oversized bouquet with both small hands, counting each step like it was part of a holy ritual. Lisa watched from the porch in her silk robe, whispering prayers under her breath, trying not to cry before the ceremony even began. It had taken years to get here. Years of sacrifice, years of building, years of love proving itself through action, not just words. Today was supposed to be the beginning of something soft, something beautiful, something theirs. But across the street, behind half-drawn blinds, Rebecca Caldwell watched with very different eyes. Rebecca was in her late 50s, a real estate broker who'd lived on Magnolia Street for over 2 decades. She'd built her reputation on knowing neighborhoods, understanding property values, and, though she'd never say it out loud, keeping certain types of people in certain types of places. For months, she'd found reasons to complain about the Bennett family moving in next door. Too many cars, too many visitors, music that drifted through her windows on weekends. She never used certain words. She was too careful for that. But everyone who heard her speak understood exactly what she meant. Most neighbors ignored her. Some nodded politely and changed the subject. A few even pushed back, gently reminding her that the Bennetts were good people, quiet people, the kind of neighbors anyone would be lucky to have. But Rebecca wasn't used to being ignored, and she certainly wasn't used to being corrected. When she saw the catering truck pull up that afternoon, when she watched a bus full of church members unload by the magnolia trees, something inside her hardened. This wasn't the kind of gathering she remembered hosting on this street. This one was bigger, louder, more vibrant, more different. To Rebecca, different meant dangerous. She marched outside with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned her own authority. Not once. Not ever. Maya didn't see her coming. One moment the little girl was adjusting her flower crown, practicing her smile. The next moment, a shadow fell across her polished shoes. Before anyone could react, Rebecca snatched the bouquet straight out of Maya's hands and threw it into the gutter like she was disposing of trash. The music stopped. Guests gasped. Maya's small hands trembled in the empty space where her flowers had been, her eyes filling with tears she didn't understand. Marcus reached them first. Lisa came running right behind. Everyone watched as Marcus positioned himself carefully between Rebecca and the child. How even in his anger, he carried the calm of a man who understood what happened to black men who raised their voices at the wrong time in the wrong place. "Ma'am," he started, his voice measured and low, "there's no reason for this. It's our wedding day. If something's bothering you, I'd be happy to—" Rebecca didn't let him finish. "I know exactly what's happening here," she snapped, her voice cutting through the yard like a blade. "This neighborhood has rules, standards. We didn't work our whole lives to live next to block parties and busloads of strangers." She pointed at the guests as if identifying criminals. People like you come in, and suddenly everything changes. Phones came out instantly. People knew what this was. They'd seen it before, lived it before, lost loved ones to moments exactly like this. Marcus held his hands low, palms open, trying to de-escalate. He attempted to guide Rebecca back toward her driveway, speaking softly, respectfully, doing everything right. But she had the kind of rage that feeds on itself. She pulled out her phone with a trembling hand and dialed 911 with the confidence of someone who believed the police belonged to her. The dispatcher's voice echoed through the speaker. Rebecca exaggerated every detail. Rowdy crowd, uncontrolled noise, suspicious activity, people who didn't belong. Her voice cracked with theatrical distress. She didn't mention that the music was a string quartet playing classical pieces. She didn't mention that the guests were elderly church members, toddlers in polished shoes, and families holding programs. She didn't mention that Marcus Bennett had lived next door for 3 years, shoveled her walkway during snowstorms, and helped her carry groceries when her back went out last spring. She made it sound like a riot. The dispatcher confirmed officers were en route. Rebecca turned to the guests with a smug, satisfied expression. 10 minutes, she announced, as if delivering justice. You should start packing up before this gets out of hand. Lisa felt her stomach drop. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply brushed his thumb over the small silver cufflink at his wrist, the one engraved with the City of Richmond seal. Only a few people in the yard knew what that meant. Rebecca certainly didn't. Down the street, the sound grew louder. Sirens. Red and blue lights flickering against the white houses, painting the magnolia trees in colors that never should have belonged to a wedding day. 2 patrol cars turned onto Magnolia Street. Guests held their breath. Parents pulled their children closer. The quartet set their instruments down in silence, and Rebecca stepped forward with the confidence of a woman ready to claim her victory. She had no idea who she was about to confront. She had no idea how fast her world was about to collapse. When the patrol cars rolled to a stop, the atmosphere shifted in a way everyone felt deep in their bones. The lights pulsed. The street fell silent except for the hum of engines and the rustle of leaves overhead. Officer Davis stepped out first, a tall man in his early 40s with the kind of face carved by long shifts and difficult calls. His partner, Officer Chen, scanned the scene with practiced efficiency, trained to spot trouble before it arrived. But as their eyes moved from the catering truck to the neatly arranged chairs to the string lights overhead, confusion flickered across their faces. This wasn't the scene described in the dispatch report. This wasn't a disturbance. This looked like a celebration. Still, procedure was procedure. Davis approached with measured steps, hand near but not on his holster. "Good afternoon," he announced, his voice steady. "We received a call about a possible disturbance at this location." Rebecca rushed toward him like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. She pointed at the gathering with a trembling finger, her voice urgent and theatrical. She described fights that hadn't happened, exaggerated noise levels, hinted at illegal activity behind the catering truck. She kept glancing back at the guests as if expecting them to explode into chaos at any moment. Chen glanced over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. He saw elderly couples holding programs, toddlers napping against their mothers' shoulders, teenagers standing quietly on the porch. Nothing about this felt unsafe or out of control. His gaze settled on Marcus. Marcus stepped forward slowly, hands visible, shoulders squared but relaxed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He simply spoke with the quiet authority of someone used to being responsible for more people than just himself. "Officers, thank you for coming. I understand you received a call, but this is a permitted wedding ceremony. We have all the paperwork if you need to see it." He reached into his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible. Several guests lifted their phones, not out of defiance, out of necessity, out of survival instincts honed by years of watching how quickly things could go wrong. Marcus handed Davis a thick folder. City permits, noise ordinance approval, vendor licenses, everything clean, clear, and legitimate. Davis flipped through it, nodding slightly. He knew paperwork. He knew what valid permits looked like. This was textbook. Before he could respond, Rebecca surged forward and snatched the top page from his hand. "These could be fake," she snapped. "You don't understand how these neighborhoods work. You let something like this slide, and next thing you know— "Ma'am," Davis cut in firmly, "I need you to step back." But Rebecca didn't step back. She leaned in closer, angrier, more emboldened than she should have been in front of uniformed officers. "I pay property taxes here. I have rights. My word should be enough to shut this down." Something in her voice, the entitlement, the presumption of ownership, made several guests shake their heads. A grandmother from Lisa's church murmured, "Lord, give me strength," under her breath. Even Rebecca's own husband, standing on their porch across the street, closed his eyes like he wished he could disappear. Officer Chen checked the noise level on his official meter. It read well below the city limit for weekend gatherings. He lifted the device slightly, showing the screen to Davis. "You're within ordinance," Chen told Marcus. Rebecca's face twisted. Since when do they get to define what's lawful in this neighborhood? Those words landed like a slap. You could feel the weight of decades in them. History, stereotypes, the unspoken rules people rarely admit to holding. And for the first time since the police arrived, Marcus's expression shifted. Not anger, not fear, something deeper. Resolve. Marcus took one breath. Then he reached into his inner coat pocket. Not quickly, but with the same slow, intentional motion he'd used before. Davis's posture stiffened slightly. Chen shifted his weight. Guests held their breath. Marcus pulled out a leather wallet. Not the ordinary kind, a professional, structured one. He opened it carefully and handed it to Officer Davis. Davis barely glanced down before his entire posture changed. His chin lifted, his shoulders straightened. His voice, which had been calm, now carried respect. "Good afternoon, Mayor Bennett." The yard erupted. Gasps, whispers, prayers of disbelief. Lisa pressed a hand to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Even the children knew something monumental had just happened, but no reaction was louder than Rebecca's. Her mouth fell open. She stared at the officers, then at the wallet, then at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. She blinked. Once, twice. Her breath hitched. "Mayor?" she choked out. You're the— No, that's impossible. You live next door." Davis handed the ID back to Marcus with the kind of reverence usually reserved for judges and high-ranking officials. "Sir, we apologize for any inconvenience," he said, loud enough for Rebecca, every guest, and every phone camera to hear. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded. "You're doing your job," he said quietly. "No apology necessary." Chen looked at Rebecca. "Ma'am, would you like to amend your complaint?" That was the moment everything inside her crumbled. She finally understood what her actions meant, who she had targeted, and how many people had witnessed it all. Her phone buzzed, and buzzed again. Notifications flooded her screen, messages, missed calls, comments from the neighborhood social media group she'd posted to earlier, thinking she'd rally support. Her world was collapsing faster than she could process. Across the yard, guests began to breathe again. Lisa wiped her eyes. Marcus put a reassuring hand on her back. The officers stepped aside to let the moment settle. And Magnolia Street, for one suspended beat of time, was completely silent, except for the sound of truth finally catching up with the person who had tried to weaponize her fear. By the time the ceremony resumed and the last guest left, Magnolia Street was no longer just a quiet road in Richmond, Virginia. It had become the center of a storm, spreading faster than anyone could grasp. What began as a neighbor's outburst was now a viral moment racing across social media platforms, news feeds, and community forums worldwide. The clip of Rebecca Caldwell's face when Officer Davis said, "Good afternoon, Mayor Bennett," hit 1 million views by nightfall. Weddings usually trend for romance. This one trended for justice. News vans arrived before sunrise the next morning. Channel 7 parked near the curb. Within an hour, 3 more local stations followed. National outlets called for interviews. Marcus declined every request. He wasn't interested in turning the worst moment of his wedding into a spectacle. He just wanted to hold Lisa's hand, process what had happened, and hope the attention would fade after a news cycle. But it didn't fade. It intensified. Video clips spread like wildfire. Ring camera footage from neighboring homes captured Rebecca's words, her tone, the bouquet she'd thrown into the gutter, her insistence that people like you didn't belong. Her 911 call, filled with embellishments and racial undertones, circulated on audio platforms and social media threads. Commentators weighed in. Civil rights advocates called for accountability. A prominent pastor referenced the incident in his Sunday sermon about the misuse of power. By Monday morning, Richmond woke up to headlines across every screen. Neighbor calls police on black wedding. Turns out Groom is the mayor. People like you. Viral video raises questions about bias in Riverside District. 911 call misuse sparks citywide conversation about race and community. At City Hall, staff scrambled. The communications director urged Marcus to release a formal statement. Council members texted constantly. The city attorney scheduled an emergency briefing. Even the governor's office called, not for political optics, but because the situation was becoming a national talking point about race, policing, and the weaponization of emergency services. Marcus didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a groom who'd married the love of his life 3 days earlier. But leadership has a way of finding you whether you want it or not. Lisa watched Marcus pace their kitchen that morning, his tie loosened, coffee going cold on the counter. She knew the weight he carried, the responsibility to respond with dignity even when the situation warranted rage. She touched his arm gently. "You didn't ask for this," she said softly, "but you know what to do." And he did. At 11 a.m., he walked into City Hall through a crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched toward him. He didn't stop for sound bites. He moved with purpose, climbing the familiar marble steps to the mayor's conference room where his staff and half the city council already waited. The city attorney began with a breakdown: false reporting, racial harassment, misuse of emergency services, and a new twist that made the room go silent. Rebecca Caldwell wasn't just a resident. She owned Caldwell Properties, a real estate firm with several municipal contracts tied to city development projects. The city had paid her company hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years to help families relocate into designated neighborhoods. Now her recorded words called into question the ethics and integrity of those contracts. Councilman Porter slammed a stack of printed comments onto the table. "This is a serious breach of public trust," he said. "A city vendor targeting our own mayor with racially charged accusations. It's unacceptable." Councilwoman Hayes shook her head. "It's bigger than the mayor. What happens when she's dealing with families who don't have his position or influence? How many people has she pushed out of neighborhoods because she thought they didn't fit?" Marcus listened quietly. He wasn't interested in personal revenge, but he couldn't ignore the broader implications. In a city still fighting pockets of discrimination and gentrification pressure, Rebecca's outburst wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. He let the room debate for nearly an hour. Then he spoke. "We're not here because someone was rude at my wedding," he said. "We're here because a woman with influence, contracts, and real authority used 911 to enforce her biases. We're here because her words weren't just hurtful, they were dangerous. If I wasn't the mayor, if this were any other black family on any other street, how might this have ended? We need to address this with fairness and clarity, not rage, not punishment for punishment's sake, but accountability." The room settled. The city attorney outlined the options: a formal review hearing, contract suspension pending investigation, and a public ethics examination. The council agreed unanimously. It wasn't a witch hunt. It was due process, a concept Marcus had fought for throughout his entire career. The hearing at Richmond City Hall was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. By 8, the line wrapped around the building. People came from Riverside, from Church Hill, from congregations across the city, from legal clinics and neighborhood associations. Some arrived because they cared about Marcus Bennett. Others came because they recognized themselves in what had happened on Magnolia Street. They wanted to see if a city that preached equality would follow through when the pressure was real. Inside the chamber, sunlight poured through tall windows onto rows of wooden benches. Lisa sat near the front, hands folded in her lap, the same poise she used when counseling families at her clinic. Her father sat beside her. Marcus's mother clutched a tissue. They were here to support Marcus, but also to witness a moment they knew would echo far beyond their own lives. On the opposite side of the aisle, Rebecca Caldwell entered with her attorney. Her shoulders were curved inward. The confident posture she'd once carried was replaced by apprehension and something that looked very close to shame. She wore a muted gray suit instead of her usual bright colors. She avoided looking at the section where several former neighbors sat, some angry, others uncomfortable, many simply stunned. Deputy Mayor Catherine Morris opened the proceedings. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it was steady. She laid out the purpose: to examine a formal complaint alleging discriminatory conduct, false reporting, and breach of city vendor ethics. She reminded the room that the goal wasn't vengeance. It was transparency, accountability, and community safety. Witnesses were called first. Neighbors who'd watched everything unfold testified about Rebecca's tone, her language, the way she escalated before police arrived. Some admitted they hadn't realized how harmful her words were until they watched the videos later. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Harrison, who'd lived on Magnolia Street since the 1970s, spoke quietly about how progress required more than new houses and fresh paint. It required new hearts. His voice shook when he said, "I've seen the city grow, but old fears don't clear out as fast as new construction." Then Lisa stepped forward. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the same strength she used when comforting families who'd lost loved ones or were waiting on difficult diagnoses. She described standing on her porch that afternoon, hearing her niece's frightened cry after the bouquet hit the gutter. She told the council what it felt like to watch her wedding day. Something sacred, something she'd waited years for, turned into a spectacle because of someone's prejudice. When she finished, the room was silent in a way that felt reverent. Finally, Rebecca was given the chance to speak. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a written statement. But when she began reading, her voice cracked before she finished the first sentence. She paused, took a breath, and lowered the papers. For the first time since the incident, she spoke without defensiveness. She admitted the fear she felt when the neighborhood started changing. She admitted making assumptions she never should have made. She admitted she'd used the police as a weapon because she felt her control slipping. And she was ashamed of that. She acknowledged that her words about people like you had deeper meaning than she understood at the time. No excuses, no deflection, just truth, raw and uneasy. The council deliberated privately, then returned with their decision. Caldwell Properties would remain on probationary contract status for 18 months. Rebecca would complete an intensive racial equity program approved by the city, submit quarterly reports demonstrating meaningful change, and complete 100 hours of community service at the Riverside Youth Center, an organization intentionally chosen to place her in proximity with the families she had feared and misunderstood. Some in the audience thought the consequences weren't harsh enough, others felt they were more than deserved. But the decision reflected the balance Marcus had always tried to strike. Firm accountability without destroying someone's livelihood. He had recused himself from the hearing, but his influence was felt gently in the measured approach. Justice shaped not by punishment alone, but by the belief that growth is possible when a community insists on it. When the gavel fell, Rebecca didn't look relieved. She looked humbled. She gathered her papers, stood, and for a moment her eyes met Lisa's. What passed between them wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement, a beginning, not an ending. 3 years after the sirens echoed down Magnolia Street, the neighborhood felt almost unrecognizable. Not because the houses had changed, but because the people had. What once was a place where neighbors kept polite distance had become a community that actually knew each other, showed up for one another, and understood the cost of staying silent when something wrong unfolded right in front of them. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in steps, in small conversations on porches, in uncomfortable meetings at City Hall, in long afternoons where people chose to listen instead of defend. The anniversary celebration grew from a simple idea Lisa mentioned during a council meeting. Why don't we turn the worst moment into something better? From that seed came the annual Unity Block Party, held every June beneath the magnolia trees lining the street. What started as a gathering of maybe 30 people had grown to hundreds. Families from across Richmond, church members, local business owners, high school students who'd written essays about the Bennett wedding in their civics classes. Marcus walked the street that afternoon with his toddler son, little Samuel, waddling beside him with a tiny bow tie askew. Lisa carried a tray of lemonade cups, laughing as kids chased each other between the booths. The mayoral title still belonged to Marcus. But days like this reminded him why he'd chosen public service in the first place. Not for accolades or speeches, but for the real, quiet work of helping people build community where it hadn't existed before. Near the center of the event, a banner stretched between two lampposts, Growing Together, Riverside Unity Day. Beneath it, a choir from First Baptist sang softly. Food trucks lined the street, offering everything from barbecue to tacos. Families sat on folding chairs, sharing tables with people they might never have spoken to 3 years earlier. What drew the most attention, however, was the small stage near the end of the block where a familiar figure stepped up to the microphone. Rebecca Caldwell looked different. Older, certainly, but also calmer. Gone was the brittle edge that once accompanied every word. Today, she stood with steady hands and a voice that didn't shake when she began. 3 years ago, I stood on this street acting like the worst version of myself, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. I can't change that day. I can't erase the harm I caused or pretend I didn't know better. But what I can do, and what I've tried to do, is listen, learn, and become someone who adds to this community instead of tearing it down. No one applauded out of habit. They listened, really listened, in a way that only comes from shared history. She spoke about the hours she'd spent at the Riverside Youth Center, tutoring kids whose names she once would have dismissed without thought. She spoke about the conversations she'd had with parents, with activists, with families who taught her the stories she'd never bothered to hear. She acknowledged the uncomfortable realization that the world she'd clung to wasn't kinder. It was simply familiar. I'm grateful this neighborhood didn't give up on me, she said quietly, and I'm even more grateful I didn't give up on myself. It wasn't a perfect speech. It wasn't meant to be, but it was honest. And honesty had been the missing ingredient the day she called 911 out of anger and fear. After she stepped down, Lisa approached her, not with forced politeness, but with a gentle nod of understanding. They weren't friends. They didn't need to be. What mattered was that they'd found a way to share a street, a history, and now a small piece of hope for what Riverside could continue becoming. Later, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Marcus took the stage. He didn't mention the wedding. He didn't mention the sirens or the moment that had thrust his family into a national spotlight. Instead, he spoke about the work still ahead. How communities don't heal because of one apology or one policy change, but because people choose to show up every day with a willingness to learn. Progress isn't loud, he said. It's steady, it's uncomfortable, and it requires us to see each other fully, not through fear or assumptions, but through our shared humanity. The applause was warm, earned, deeply human. As dusk settled, Maya, now 10, taller, her confidence blooming, walked toward Lisa holding a bouquet. This one didn't get thrown into a gutter. Rebecca had handed it to her quietly earlier that afternoon, wrapped in soft paper. When Maya offered it to Lisa, the moment caught in everyone's throat. It wasn't a replacement for what had been lost years ago, but it was a gesture that carried weight. Neighbors lingered even after the music faded, reluctant to leave the warmth of what they'd built together. Riverside wasn't perfect. Prejudice hadn't magically disappeared, but something had shifted in the 3 years since the sirens. People understood what silence cost. They understood what courage looked like. And they understood that community wasn't just about property lines. It was about responsibility. As Marcus and Lisa walked home beneath the magnolia trees, their son's tiny hand in theirs, the street felt like exactly the place they'd hoped it would one day become. A neighborhood learning, slowly but steadily, how to be better than it used to be. The story of Marcus Bennett, Lisa Brooks, and the neighborhood of Riverside is, in many ways, the story of America in miniature. A single afternoon that exposed long-buried assumptions, awakened a quiet community, and reminded everyone how quickly fear can turn into harm when it goes unexamined. What began with one woman's anger at a black wedding spiraled into a moment that tested dignity, tested leadership, and forced an entire city to look itself in the mirror. But what followed, slow, imperfect, deliberate, became proof that transformation is possible when people refuse to turn away from truth. Marcus's composure on the day of the wedding wasn't just professionalism. It was the strength of a man who'd spent his life navigating situations where calm meant survival. When the officers realized he was the mayor, he didn't retaliate or humiliate. Instead, he insisted on due process, transparency, and fairness, values that shaped every step that followed. Lisa stood beside him with a quiet resilience that never needed to shout to be heard. Even when her wedding day was torn apart, she chose grace over bitterness. And that grace rippled outward into the community. For Rebecca Caldwell, the moment became a turning point she never expected. What she intended as a call for control turned into a confrontation with her own bias, her own fear, and her own narrow understanding of the community around her. The consequences she faced were real and necessary, but they weren't designed to break her. They were designed to change her. Through long hours of community service, equity training, and hard conversations with the very people she once mistrusted, Rebecca learned what accountability truly means. Not performative apologies, not excuses. But honest, uncomfortable self-reflection followed by daily action. She became proof that people can change. Slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. Riverside changed alongside her. Neighbors who once kept distance began leaning into community. The city strengthened policies around discriminatory emergency calls. The annual Unity Block Party became a tradition rooted in healing. And the children who witnessed the chaos that day grew up watching adults choose responsibility over rage, growth over shame, and empathy over defensiveness. Looking back 3 years later, the sirens on Magnolia Street weren't the end of something. They were the beginning. A beginning that showed what happens when good people insist on fairness, when leaders choose humility, when communities refuse to hide behind silence. And when those who make harmful choices are given the tools and the expectation to become better versions of themselves. The deeper lesson for all of us is clear. Progress doesn't start in the halls of government. It starts in homes, in neighborhoods, in the tiny decisions people make when no one is watching. It begins when we question our assumptions, challenge the narratives we've absorbed, and listen with the intention to understand rather than defend. Real community isn't built by people who agree on everything. It's built by people committed to treating each other with dignity, even when tensions rise. So ask yourself, what biases am I carrying, even unknowingly? What conversations have I been avoiding? And how can I choose courage over comfort in my own corner of the world? If this story resonated with you, if it moved you, challenged you, or opened your heart in any way, please subscribe to this channel. Your support encourages us to keep creating meaningful, powerful stories that spark change and inspire compassion. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more stories that remind us who we are and who we can become when we choose understanding over fear. Because the truth is, we all live on Magnolia Street. We all have neighbors we don't fully understand. We all carry fears we haven't examined, and we all have the power to choose differently. Not perfectly, but honestly, one small, courageous step at a time.